Hey there. Guess this is going to be a controversial video, but if we self-censor because we're afraid that we might offend people or provoke people, then we'll end up just being sheep and never speaking. And I don't think that's a good way to live. Um, it's not that I think that we should be provocative for the sake of it, but I do believe that if you can't speak your conviction, you're just going to end up in a situation where you're overly cautious all the time. So that's my approach. Um, in the video I made about Hogan and Ali, I was expecting a response, and it's kind of, I was going through the comments, and some of them were pretty much as I predicted. Um, I'm not going to call the individuals out. That would be, I'm not looking for that sort of thing, but I will just cite the sort of thing that we're talking about to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So the predictable response, one of them was, well, Ali grew up in a time of, terrible racism and segregation and so on. So that explains his attitude, or that justifies his attitude. Um, that might explain it. I mean, there's no question about it. America has had a very dark history, a very shameful history in many ways of treating black citizens as second class. I'm acutely aware of the sickening history of lynchings, particularly in the Deep South, but elsewhere as well. That went well into the 20th century. I mean, any decent human being should be totally sickened by that stuff. It was absolutely horrendous. And to be specific to boxing, when the great black champion Jack Johnson won fights, there would be race riots. So America absolutely has a shameful history in that regard. Um, But one of the individuals who responded to the video claimed I didn't understand American history well. I have studied it extensively, actually, and I'm very aware of that. So Ali having the views on race that he did might be understandable. But here's the caveat. Other prominent black fighters of the time, and I think I mentioned this in the video, people like Floyd Patterson, even Sonny Liston, who'd been incarcerated, had all the reasons in the world to be bitter with the white establishment. Um, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, all of those guys, none of them race baited the way Ali did. None of them held those views to that extent. But I'm sure they would have had times of deep resentment and frustration and hurt, the way Ali did. In fact, George Foreman, when he famously waved the little American flag, he got flagged for that. He was deemed to be betraying black power in the late 60s. So, this young guy had won his Olympic medal and he didn't really get credit from it in the black community. So, Ali's views may be explained by the context of the time, but I would simply point out that other black fighters did not carry those attitudes to that extent. They just didn't. Other black fighters didn't join the Nation of Islam, which absolutely is a black supremacist group. Now, one of the comments actually questioned if the very idea of black supremacy exists, and of course it does. The Southern Poverty Hate Center, the Research Center, I think is the formal name, they list a lot of white supremacist groups, but they also include black supremacist groups. And it isn't rocket science. Anyone who believes in racial superiority is, by definition, a racial supremacist. In my whole life, I have called out and condemned white racists. As a white guy, I think I have a responsibility to do that. I abhor racism in all of its forms. But I don't think that we go forward on this by saying, well, some kinds of racism are okay. I think that's a regressive attitude. One of the comments said that if Ali made the sort of things he said in the 1960s today, he would get heat for it. That's probably true, but I do think there's double standards. I mean, the reality is, if you get a white victim of crime at the hands of a black person, the race factor is not going to be mentioned. that if you get a black victim of racist hate crime, that will be mentioned. So why the double standards? And that's both sides of the Atlantic, actually. Um, Black power is deemed to be, a noble and worthy thing. White power is connected with, the far right and white supremacy. By the way, I don't advocate it. I don't believe in any sort of racial power. I think it's a very backward way of thinking. Um, but I just find the double standards to be regressive. I don't see how that is part of the solution at all. Now, usually the refrain to this is, well, white people haven't experienced what black people have, so they have no right to lecture on this. And there may be some truth in that. I haven't been in the shoes of a black American, but I think it's valid as a human being to say that there is some need for consistency. Um, and I don't really accept this attitude that, for instance, if you've been a victim of racism or bigotry, that justifies being hostile to an entire group. I just don't think it does. I think it can explain bitterness towards perpetrators, and even it might even explain bitterness and resentment towards an entire group for a period. At some point, you have to look at the world in a wider way and think, no, you can't generalize an entire race as one and the same. I mean, throughout history, that has been the very basis for racial hatred, seeing an entire group as one and the same. I contend that Muhammad Ali's attitude on race was the polar opposite of Martin Luther King. Now, to be fair, Ali was by no means the worst in terms of black racism. And I will say that later in life, he absolutely did moderate. He did. And I give Ali credit for his extensive charity and humanitarian work. I mean, the thing about this is, people just think because I'm criticizing him, I'm totally vilifying him. Not at all. I'm open minded enough to recognize his many positive points. But the thing is, as a historic figure, I absolutely will insist that he and anyone else who's an important historic figure should not be above critique. I mean, personality cults around celebrities are a very, in my view, very unhealthy thing. Um, it's this mindset of supporters of a particular public figure who just get so reactionary and so aggressive in their condemnation of anyone who dares think outside the box. Me, we've definitely seen it with Donald Trump supporters. That's why I talk about the Trump cult, because I think it is cult-like. I mean, the people who used violence on January the 6th were acting out of devoted loyalty to Trump. The fact that they were prepared to use violence, the fact some of them died, that's cult-like. Absolutely. Every cult in history has had that. Now, when it comes to celebrities like Muhammad Ali, I would say to some extent it was around Michael Jackson. Um, dare I say Princess Diana as well. Um, there's other examples, John Lennon, where the idolization is such that anyone who thinks outside the box is immediately attacked as being an ignorant person or bitter or um, just seeking attention or jealous or you name it, instead of people actually bothering to consider, well, they were human beings, so they weren't perfect. Um, I mean, if I myself was a prominent public figure and I said these things about Ali, I'd be crucified. I would be absolutely cancelled. Because in the boxing world, even 9 years after his passing, you could barely say these things. And the reactions, some of the reactions I got in that video just proves it. Proves my point. It's not just about Ali. There's others as well where we see this attitude. But I really have a big problem with double standards when it comes to race. I don't see why black racists should get away with it. I don't see why black racists should be, their attitude can be condoned by, well, historically black people were persecuted, so therefore, holding animosity toward all white people is okay. I've even seen there's been incidents in the United States where there has been a black perpetrator of violence, and lawyers have literally tried to use black rage as a defense line. I believe this was the case in a shooting in Long Island in 1993, where the perpetrator, a black guy, killed, I think it was 8 or 9 people, and his lawyers literally tried to use black rage as a defense, i.e., he was motivated by the historic injustices against African Americans. That justifies killing innocent people. I mean, it's absurd. Um, So I don't know. The problem is how do you meet someone halfway if their attitude is some kinds of racism are okay? Because no matter what you say to them, they will always dismiss it. They will always find a way to justify that sort of bigotry. It pisses me off. In Britain, we've had cases where the victim, you get white victims of racist hate crime, and the BBC, just hasn't reported it to the same extent. Just hasn't. There was 3 cases spanning from the 1990s to the early 2010s where 3 young white guys were the victims of racist hate crimes, um, where the perpetrators were either black or Asian, and it didn't get anywhere near the sort of attention of the Stephen Lawrence case. Now, any decent person will know that the Stephen Lawrence case was a high-profile racist murder of a young black teenager in London. It was awful. But the perpetrators were, they were sent to prison. Um, I just think that there has to be consistency in the media, and for any so-called anti-racist, I have a big, big problem with anti-racists who cherry pick what sort of racism they're against. Um, and it isn't just coming from minority racists; it's coming from white woke people who somehow think they're being open-minded by defending racism when it comes from minorities. They'll say, "Oh well, it's their attitude can be excused." No, I don't think it can. I think if you're a free-thinking adult, I don't care if you're white, black, Hispanic, Asian. If you are hostile to an entire other race, you know, you just need to open your mind. I really believe that. Um, And if you want to explain this, this persecution factor, you could, if you take that line of thought, then a white victim of, say, a black gang would be justified in hating all white people, all black people, because, they'd hold resentment toward that very unpleasant and traumatizing experience. So then they would be justified in hating all black people. Or to use another example, if you have a young boy who's brutalized by his mother, he has a really, really abusive mother. He ends up becoming a serial killer, a misogynistic serial killer, targeting women. No reasonable person's going to justify that, but might explain it. In fact, there is an example of that. Ed Kemper had a mother who was horrendously abusive, and of course, he became one of America's most infamous serial killers. He targeted young women at college campuses. He's still alive. He's still serving a life sentence. Um, and among his victims was his own mother. But if you look at the background in that case, um, would feminists say? I wonder what the feminist attitude to that would be. Would his abusive mother justify his hatred of women? I don't think so. Um, so anyway, in conclusion, I really, really have a problem with this idea that some forms of racism are okay because they happen to be coming from minorities. That's a BS idea. It's a divisive idea, and it's all it does is cause deeper divisions. One of the big reasons I had a problem with the Black Lives Matter movement is they pretend to be anti-racist, and yet they defended racists in their midst. They polarized some white allies who were supportive of that. I mean, um, I think they had some legitimate concerns, particularly around police accountability and police brutality. But then you started seeing contradictions. For instance, there was one case in, I believe it was Tennessee, where it was a case of police brutality and a black man died. And the great irony was the police officers involved in that particular case were all black. So how does that tap into Black Lives Matter when the police officers in question were themselves black? Maybe it's actually a wider issue or more specific issue of police brutality rather than necessarily a race thing in that sense. The other problem with that narrative is ignores white victims of police brutality or Hispanic victims of police brutality or Asian victims of police brutality. Um, with Hulk Hogan, he got absolutely condemned because he used the N word. Now, I think it was ugly what he said. I would never condone what he said. And some people would argue he only apologized because he got caught out. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. But I think it is fair to say America is hyper, hyper, hyper sensitive with race. Um, other countries are sensitive over certain issues. With America, it's race. And if a white public figure uses the N word, I mean, they can apologize to the blue in the face, but they will be vilified forever. Now, there's other things I think Hogan deserved criticism for as well. He was a union buster. When Jesse Ventura and other wrestlers tried to unionize, Hogan actively tried to oppose that. His treatment of other wrestlers was nothing to shout about. He refused to get young guys over. Um, so there was that side of him as well. I'm in support for Donald Trump. I mean, I'm critical of anyone who supports Donald Trump, quite frankly. Um, Especially after everything he done. The fact that he is a convicted felon, the fact that he um, promoted domestic insurrection. I just cannot understand how anyone would support that man. Um, and Hogan was one of his big cheerleaders, so that goes against him. But in terms of his racist language, he apologized repeatedly for that. So my question is, if a white celebrity uses racist language, should they be condemned for all eternity? I mean, for anyone of a faith background, what about Christian forgiveness or Muslim forgiveness, Buddhist forgiveness? Um, I don't agree that someone should be vilified forever. I just don't agree with that. Um, anyway, I'll wrap this up. But these are just musings. These are just general thoughts. I really, really, really have a big problem with the mindset that it's racism's bad. Let's condemn racism, but let's only condemn certain kinds of racism. Let's only condemn it when it's white people. If it's anyone else, oh well, it's history. If we want to really, really talk about history and be honest about history, let's talk about the Barbary slave trade. The North African Barbary pirates kidnapped and enslaved white Europeans in coastal areas of Spain, Ireland, and I believe England as well. That's totally forgotten to history. Doesn't get anywhere near the same attention as the transatlantic slave trade. Why not? Why not? Um, I suppose you could argue that the legacy isn't the same because the effects of the transatlantic slave trade went down generations, perhaps in a more profound way. But the Barbary slave trade was a historic reality. Anyway, I digress a bit. I don't know. Thing is, I'm acutely aware as a white guy saying this, there'll be reactionary idiots who say, "You can't say that. How dare you say that? How dare you tell the truth? How dare you point these things out?" Well, I will continue being consistent. I will continue condemning white racists. My whole life I've condemned white racists. It's an ugly, ugly attitude. I will always condemn it. Um, but I will also condemn hypocrites who claim to be anti-racist, display racism of their own, or cherry pick which racism they oppose. It's why I have a big problem with the woke left. It's why I have a big problem with Black Lives Matter. They're hypocrites. It's that simple. They are hypocrites. polarizing hypocrites. Anyway, we'll wrap this up.